A dwarf sentenced to the depths of the mountain to mine and earn their freedom back. A cold, dark and dangerous place it is, riddled with monsters, beasts and a touch of magic. Falterstone is a bit of action, adventure, RPG, roguelite and survival, and is here to depict what solo development truly is, in the form of endless challenges and problems to solve. This prototype merely focuses on the feel of the game, hence the atrocious look to save time, which would be otherwise done well, as the skills and knowledge are there from the many years, but not the tools and resources to do so. But fear not, and embrace the depths of the mountain as it calls.
Opportunities, more often than not, don't just simply fall out of the sky. Rather, you have to work hard for them and make your own choices along the way, in hopes that those will eventually lead to somewhere desirable, all the while battling the unknown and your concerns, as there is no second opinion to guide you and save you from the fall. To illustrate this, there were a number of different paths to choose from for working on this release. These included the following: the introduction of gathering and food resources, think of harvesting fruits from a tree or a shrub as an example, atmospheric mechanics and potentially mobs to reflect those at a later stage, to further explore the mines, give it more life as it is, and include multi-purpose items such as fire, among other things, or working on expanding on resource gathering in preparation for the introduction of the inevitable weight limit, or exploring the realm of building or crafting more, say with traps and defensive structures, because crafting tools and weapons is off limits at the moment, as those would not add much to the gameplay, so to speak. And finally, the possible route of exploring more of the dwarvish realm of beliefs and customs. The obvious one, the one that was the most glaring and was left untouched for a reason, was the absence of decent atmospheric lighting, the kind that brings scenes to life and gives them their charm with its moody appearance by providing a variety of interesting things to look at, hiding and revealing shapes and forms by using no other than light itself. It's the most basic thing in the book, but makes the biggest difference of all. No wonder it took decades for games to catch up. Although Falterstone is just a mere prototype with placeholder art and assets, there was a reason why words such as cold and dark were used to describe the game. Because the original intent was to create, well, an environment that suits the world of the underground with its mood for the adventure where it would take place in. Not this overly bright scene with the lava in the background that you currently see in the game. That was just a split-second decision to spice up the monotone aesthetics, as otherwise everything would be lit the same or more or less the same, and the greys and the browns are not the most pleasant things to look at for long periods of time if there's no variety in them. It would have been a chasm of some sorts as the backdrop, using clever techniques to give it more of the space than what it actually is there, as mines, as you'd expect, can be quite the daunting and mysterious places to exist, which was hoped to be reflected in the game as well. Would note, on a side tangent, that this is why in the future, creatures such as spiders and the like, not part of the special creature design mind you, would play a huge role if there would be parts of the game that were poorly lit, as the intent is to give, sticking with spiders for example, the ability to change the environment to their liking, say placing webs all around to create an additional challenge to overcome, because whenever you introduce a mechanic or a new form of interaction, the possibilities suddenly open up, as more often than not you are given the option to explore new tools and solutions at your own leisure. In this case, it could be that these nasty underground creatures will create such a strong silk for their web that our poor dwarf would need to have a special tool or weapon to counter those, which could easily lead into crafting and perhaps enchanting, and so forth. Speaking of enchanting, it is something that I'm considering adding to the roster, as it could add an additional layer to the game and as such would be beneficial for long-term replays. because the goal with the tools and weapons in this game is ultimately focused around reusability and practicality, which translates to the simple fact that I'm not overly keen to make this game a loot hoarder's dream by dropping every item under the sun every few seconds and force the player to sift through those. That level of manipulative gambling does not add much in the long term and often causes a lot of frustration if poorly implemented, and requires a lot of fine-tuning as well. To make sure the player stays on curve and finds meaningful upgrades as they go, this is the reason why it is extremely difficult to do, as it has a lot of variables and more often than not it delivers short. Hence things may drop poorly from bosses but not from regular opponents. Plus, it would not really fit the overall narrative of the dwarf that was cast into the shadows, realistically speaking, who more or less would stick to their tools the entire time, which is the way this game is intended to be designed around. This is also something that reflects my long-standing philosophy, as mentioned in the previous blog, where substance triumphs over meaningless abundance. Nonetheless, there's plenty to explore and implement still, so a lot could go and will change in the future. But I digress, so let's get back to where we were before, talking about lighting. While this is still at the core of the design, as it can produce a variety of interesting scenarios for both combat and other activities. Say with fearsome creatures, as there are plans to create some radically different monsters and beasts for the mines, inspired by one of the most bizarre creatures on the planet, or the use of dark itself as a mechanic, or as a quote-unquote living being that has its own mind, playing with shadows and light, or having the option of open fire to be utilitarian and a source of light as well, to perhaps cook or craft with, or even use it against your enemies. Well, unfortunately, all this was put on hold due to the reason of it being impossible to pull off in this version of Unreal Engine, speaking from a rendering point of view, using light as the main and only source of visibility, as with clever shaders most of it can be faked and more or less accurately represent, but that route is less ideal to pursue with modern tech at your fingertips. They are slowly becoming obsolete as well. And as such, version 4 simply does not have the functionality that can enable it to create accurate, dynamically lit environments as seen in a previous release of Falterstone. Notice how there's this stark contrast between the dark and lit areas, and as a consequence it appears to be quite outdated by today's standards, which is why the pitch black shadows were patched out in order to suit the overall aesthetic slightly better and be less of an eyesore for non-devs. That's one of the reasons why the black fog is surrounding the player at all times, to limit visibility and sort of compensate for the lack of dark areas, which, as some of you might have guessed, was solved in Unreal Engine 5 with their new fancy tech called Lumen, which remains something for the distant future to look forward to and explore, as it would save a lot of precious time that could be spent elsewhere. Then the thought of traps and defensive structures were crossed over the list, like walls, maybe some form of turrets, which is debatable but only by a faint margin, as building a tower defense game is not something I'm overly keen on doing as well. It has no place here, as currently a good fit for the game is yet to be found for their use, as the driving force behind the design is to keep it moving at all times or to have minimal downtime, which translates to the simple fact that generally the player should not stick around at any given place for too long, regardless of the activity. This was also one of the reasons why full-blown farming, e.g. planting crops then tending those by, weeding, watering, etc., or traditional base building, as in essentially making a home for yourself that you can come back to or shelter you from the elements, was entirely ignored. Bases are nice, but an overused concept, offering very little for an adventure game like this, where the point is to, explore and live the moment, to be part of said adventure, as it serves the narrative better, not by building impenetrable forts around you. The latter is concerning enough from a design point of view, as in that scenario, you are tasked with a much greater dilemma, forcing you to solve and efficiently counter the power creep that hoarding presents. The moment you introduce ways to defend and build up a fort for the player, all goes out the window, as now you suddenly need to think of all the possibilities one could exploit against the world that someone has designed for them. This is the classic case where unaware AI can be formed if you simply limit their paths to one lane. But that's just one example of many, because it can break a game entirely if not careful enough, as at that point nothing stops the player to max out their stats and tools, to then find the game lacking and boring to complete. This is why a great deal of thought needs to be put into such quote-unquote trivial matters, such as allowing a player to build a house or not. But back to the list. Now, on the topic of gathering and the potential of casual sources of food production is still on the table, as there are plans to incorporate nature more to the caves as well, not just the quote-unquote jungle, which would be mostly out in the open as discussed in the previous episode, but some of the areas of the mines as well, as cave life isn't as barren as one would think, not necessarily for the reason to have foliage in the mines, to have something to look at, or to break up the monotone color schemes of caves, but for the reason to interact with. In what way, you'd ask? Well, one of the aspects of the design is to include a greater codependency between the player and the environment. Actions have consequences, and everyone should be aware of that. That's the reason why careless mining can invoke cave-ins, or the accidental hitting on a spring, which then floods the nearby area. The one thing that kept this one being integrated and set up for this update was for the fact that the idea needs more work. There are some vague concepts on how nature could fit into all this, whilst also keeping in mind that technically the response from the environment is already there, in the form of cave-ins, etc. Thus would clash with the set of rules of the design for this prototype anyway, to only add things that are not yet implemented. One thing is for certain, that harvestable food would probably be integrated into the waterfalls, perhaps be placed near those, to act as a nurturing ground of some sorts, which one could periodically return to and harvest if need be. Additionally, the thinking was that perhaps overgrowth should be a part of the equation, similarly blocking the player's path to how waste rocks block path now, or by creating interesting pockets of areas, or be a threat to the player, e.g. by being poisonous or being animated to attack the player in one way or another. That being said, it wasn't fleshed out enough to be considered at this stage, so it was left out. Next was the exploring of the beliefs of the dwarves. Their rituals and common practices was something that's been wanting my attention for some time now, as there could be a lot to explore there, not just for the sake of gameplay, but to deepen the narrative about dwarves and building up the juicy lore, and to provide an insight into how they live, act and think, which is the providing substance to this whole adventure, fitting and encouraging me to implement it somehow. That being said, it is not exactly clear how this could be part of the game without breaking the illusion more of playing as a dwarf from a third person's view, as anything that's not accessible in the game world, say having to interact with an UI, is already a big enough sin, and right now I can't really imagine a suitable situation where it wouldn't fall into the category of magic, which is already part of the game, that isn't using runes, is fun, and can provide longevity in its use, because erecting places of worship or building something else must provide something more than simply being there as a structure. And to me, running around in circles just isn't fun. What might work, and perhaps will be one of the possible routes, is to seek out tasks as in physically doing something or something similar like a quest, where you'd need to appeal to a certain deity of some sorts that could then grant you abilities, say at a shrine for some arbitrary time. This, the use of buffs, is already in the game when you accidentally find a waterfall that heals, and could be used as a complementary to those. If we go this route, and this the potential issue with violating the design rules for this prototype. All of this extensive elimination led me with the last and immediate option of working on minecarts and all sorts of debris accumulating from mining to expand the core loop of the game and provide a solution for long-term exploration, as resource gathering could become a chore if long distances are involved. Let me break down the two, because there's a lot more to unpack than one might think. It has to be said that mining is a devastating process for the environment, no matter how we look at it, and normally you'd need to mine out a lot of useless material before reaching any precious minerals, which is why, generally, quarries look the way they look, like massive craters on the surface, and as such, games tend to mirror this real-life phenomenon in their usual mechanics, by throwing a bunch of useless stuff at you. Knowing this, that there would be a surplus of material associated with mining was already thought of day one for this game, albeit not in a functional way as it does now. It would have looked more like just a simple visual effect to add some juice to the game that would fade away quickly. However, I was wondering if there could be of use of these if they were implemented in a more practical way, because it's certainly not fun to carry and clog up your inventory with a bunch of rocks and dirt, right? While some games hope to mimic what's out there in the real world, they also tend to force your hand to deal with all the extra inconvenience that comes with such mechanics, in the form of piles upon piles. The thinking was, this time around, that it would be best not to include in the usual way. I wanted this mechanic to be part of the game, but not as a source of frustration. Well, hopefully, rather a subtle reminder that your actions have consequences that affect you and your surroundings, and on top of it all, be an additional way to gather materials for building and crafting, ones that could only be found in waste rocks, like flint in this case, which is not overly realistic, but it gives the task of having to deal with these small roadblocks of some sort of redemption, if you may, by providing something in return. Well, some of the time that is. What's more, giving these falling bits of rock mass and shape made them unavoidable in the game where positioning is crucial, and as you never know what might attack you from the dark, once there's darkness in the game that is. So you'd better be clearing your surroundings quite often before finding yourself enclosed at a dead end. It might seem a bit of an extra hustle to have to mine these additional rocks all over, however, so far, there was no immediate consequence for mining in the game, apart from the occasional cave-ins and water damage, which also lacked a little bit of excitement. Well, mining of its own is not the most enjoyable aspects of life anyway. Now that mining was associated with physical obstructions, a level of urgency has been put in the one task that is crucial for your survival: mining. After all, the core game loop is still just a simple resource gathering to buy our freedom back. Likewise, making these bits of rock disappear after being taken care of not just frees up any potential headache from unnecessary inventory management, but the need to organize, dispose, or transport for long-term storage. In the end, I'd call this a win-win situation. For now, these bits of waste rock will only drop one type of item, but probably, as you could imagine, the possibilities are almost endless for their future use, especially when it comes to crafting or enchanting finer weapons and tools, which is something still under hefty debate, as it isn't clear how exactly that would come to life. Say how blacksmithing could be implemented to the game, because usually metalworking is confined to a stationary place and requires a sort of base, which is a big no-no for the planned pace of the game, as said before. Although traveling forges and other makeshift methods do exist, so maybe those could be a viable route, it's just not crystal clear how the whole process would be streamlined in a fast and interesting way without having to resort to looking at long progress bars and wasting time at one destination or another. After all, Falterstone is not competing to become just another farming simulator or plain survival sandbox with long-term industrial levels of resource management and overbearing complexity where you need to have lexical knowledge of how things work and what the order of operations are, or anything along those lines. It would simply not fit the theme of this more casual, action-oriented approach this game is aiming for. Now, the other, more substantial part of this was to implement minecarts. Think of them as the backbone of the operation whilst in the caves, for the simple reason that at some point a weight system will be implemented to somehow limit the amount of things a dwarf could carry, which in return called for a transport solution of some kind as to balance the need to go back and forth long distances. This, the grinding of materials that is, can easily become just another chore to do, with a hefty amount of frustration suffused on top if space has a fine limit. And as the game does not use inventory management, something needed to be done in this regard. The idea is that the deeper you'd venture, the more pressing it would become to find something to carry your loot back to the entrance. On a side note, I'm not entirely sure if there would be a way to go down or just leave it on one level as is. That's another debate for the future. It was part of the original design, but for simplicity's sake, it was abandoned. But what is certain that the final version would use a 360 degree of freedom, meaning you'd be able to mine all over the place, not just the right side of the map. It was set up this way, as it was already complex enough to code for a prototype, as the game uses this grid system for everything, including the AI, so it had to be built robust enough to withstand the abuse. Hence, the implementation of minecarts came to be, acting more like mobile chests than something to ride in. Technically, you could push them around to your chosen destination, albeit very slowly if not on tracks, which is why there's this rudimentary inventory that will pop up if you get close enough to the cart to see the contents of it all. You can put stuff in but not take out at the moment. Probably that will stay for the future, for various gameplay related reasons, like urgency. While there's only 3 types of tracks to choose from, more are planned for the future to make it more convenient to use, like using switches to help build larger rail systems if needed. It has to be said that the cart must be kept safe, as it cannot be picked up once placed, and thus it can be damaged by projectiles or the player and can lose half or more of its contents when destroyed, unless it gets pushed close enough to the entrance where it automatically empties its cargo in return for coins. Now comes the question of which item on the list should be implemented next, as there could be numerous overlaps within the many, and as mentioned before, the goal for this prototype is to establish an overall feel for the game, rather than filling it with content that wouldn't necessarily expand upon the flavor of the experience. Feel free to let me know what you think about this and the concepts described in this devlog. With that being said, we've arrived at that point again. Thank you for being part of this journey and hoping to see you in the future. Take care and see you in the next one.